ideological state. Take out Judaism from Israel and it will fall like a house of cards. Take Islam out of Pakistan and make it a secular state, it would collapse. This is what Pakistan's former president Zia-ul Haq said in 1981. He basically implied that Pakistan and Israel were identical. Interesting idea. Pakistan and Israel also do not recognize each other. They do not have diplomatic ties. But is that about to change? Some interesting developments have come to light. Pakistan has made an outreach. A Pakistani delegation was in Israel last week. It was headed by a lobbyist. It had business owners and journalists. They held a meeting with the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. This meeting and this visit was sponsored by a pro-Israeli group, a group called Sharaka, or Partnership in Arabic. Now this group was set up for the Abraham Accords, the ones that were signed in 2020. The group works to connect Israel with Gulf countries. And this is what they said about the Pakistani visit. I'm quoting, "The delegates spoke to the president about their efforts to develop a relationship with Israel and build peace in the Middle East." Well, that's a lot of effort to promote a relationship that does not even exist, at least on paper. One report says this outreach is going to continue and that another Pakistani delegation will visit Israel by the end of this year. This engagement has already sparked political controversy in Pakistan. Former Human Rights Minister, Pakistan has one, former Human Rights Minister Shireen Mazari has spoken out. She has highlighted the presence of a journalist with links to the Pakistani security establishment. The journalist is called Ahmed Qureshi. He was part of this delegation that went to Israel. And this is what Shireen Mazari said about him. I have that statement with me. "Shocking to see Ahmed Qureshi in Israel because he not only works for PTV, but is also closely linked to a state institution of sensitive nature. For over a year, he has been pushing a pro-Israeli agenda and targeted Imran Khan's independent foreign policy." This is a very serious issue and we need a formal answer from DGISPR. This is Shireen Mazari. She's talking about the Pakistani military here, DGISPR. And of course, we should take these with a pinch of salt, all of these claims. Shireen Mazari, after all, is a politician. Imran Khan and his party are trying every trick in the book to make the foreign conspiracy angle stick. That a foreign conspiracy was trying to topple his government. But Islamabad's outreach cannot be ignored. And it should be seen in the current context. Pakistan's economy is in a shambles, we know that. Ukraine and Russia to start supplying food again. Before the war, these countries supplied more than 30% of the world's wheat, more than 17% of the world's corn, and almost 80% of the world's sunflower oil. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been negotiating with Moscow. He wants the blockade in Ukraine to be lifted, but Russia refuses to make concessions. They first want some sanctions relief. A statement has come out of Moscow. Dmitry Medvedev has spoken out. He's the former president of Russia. Right now, he's a senior security official. And I have that statement with me. This is what he says. "Our country is ready to fulfill its obligations in full, but it also expects assistance from trading partners. Otherwise, there's no logic. On the one hand, insane sanctions are being imposed against us. On the other, they're demanding food supplies. Things don't work like that. We are not idiots." That's what he says. We are not idiots. So neither side is prepared to relent. And this standoff puts millions of lives at risk. What happens when shortages become worse? There'll be hoarding of grains, especially in the rich countries. Yesterday, India too spoke out at the United Nations. It warned against the hoarding of food grains. And this is what India said, and I'm quoting again, "We have already seen to our great cost how these principles were disregarded in the case of COVID-19 vaccines. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. A fractured global order will make the food crisis worse. Food is not a weapon. Food should not be a weapon. It's a victim of the war in Ukraine, and it's now being used to score."
Surrendering Ukrainian fighters through the streets of Mariupol. Russian officials say nearly 1,000 Ukrainian fighters surrendered this week after they were surrounded and made a last stand at a steel factory. Russia, describing them as neo-Nazis, says it will interrogate each one for possible crimes against civilians. Moscow seems to be sending a message after Ukraine put the first Russian soldier on trial for a war crime. The 21-year-old Russian sergeant pleaded guilty to shooting a Ukrainian civilian outside Kyiv and is potentially facing life in prison. His lawyer says he was ordered to shoot by his commander, who thought the Ukrainian would give away the Russians' position. In Kyiv, the United States is now back in business officially, raising the flag over the American embassy there. Diplomats were ordered out of the country in the early days of the war, when it seemed Russia might quickly take over the entire country. Instead, Russian troops were first driven back from Kyiv and now from around the eastern city of Kharkiv, where Ukrainian forces have been blowing up bridges to stop Russian advances. But while Russian troops are struggling to hold territory, their grip on the port city of Mariupol and a naval blockade in the Black Sea are strangling Ukraine, cutting off many imports and the export of the country's most important commodity, grain. The head of the World Food Program made a direct appeal to President Putin to let Ukraine export its grain for the sake of global food security.
It is absolutely essential that we allow these ports to open, because this is not just about Ukraine. This is about the poorest of the poor around the world who are on the brink of starvation as we speak. So I ask President Putin, if you have any heart at all, to please open these ports.
Today, President Biden meets with leaders from Finland and Sweden after the two nations yesterday formally submitted their bids to join NATO.